London, September 1944. The city had endured 4 years of war, but nothing prepared its people for what came next. The V-2 rocket, Hitler's revenge weapon, arrived without warning. No air raid sirens, no time to seek shelter. One moment you were alive, the next, an entire street disappeared in a thunderous explosion. By the time you heard the sound, it was already too late for someone else. Margaret Hayes was an ordinary housewife living in Chiswick, West London. Her husband Thomas served with the Royal Engineers somewhere in France. She spent her days working at a munitions factory and her nights volunteering at the local civil defense post. But Margaret possessed something that would soon prove invaluable: an obsessive attention to patterns and an old mechanical kitchen timer that never left her apron pocket. Before we continue with Margaret's extraordinary discovery, if you're enjoying this story of courage and ingenuity during humanity's darkest hour, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more of these incredible, untold stories to light. September 8th, 1944 started like any other wartime morning. Margaret stood in her small kitchen preparing weak tea with the month's ration. The wallpaper, once a cheerful yellow, had faded to a sickly cream. Outside her window, the street showed the scars of the Blitz. A gap where the Thorntons' house once stood, boarded windows and sandbags stacked against doorways. The explosion came at 6:43 in the evening. Margaret was stirring a pot of vegetable soup, mostly turnips and carrots, from her small victory garden when the world shook. The windows rattled violently. Her china cabinet toppled forward, shattering her mother's tea set across the floor. The sound arrived seconds later, a deep roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. She ran outside. 3 streets away, a column of smoke rose into the gray sky. Neighbors emerged from their homes, faces pale, hands trembling. Mrs. Patterson from number 12 was crying, her apron covered in flour. Young Billy Morrison stood frozen on his doorstep, his cricket bat still in his hands. Civil defense wardens rushed past, their boots heavy on the pavement. Margaret recognized Arthur Wellings, a retired postman who now spent his nights watching for fires. "What was it, Arthur?" she called out. He stopped, breathing hard. "Don't know, Mrs. Hayes. No warning at all, no sirens, no planes, just boom." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, listening to the distant sounds of rescue operations. The explosion played in her mind again and again. No warning, no air raid sirens. In 4 years of war, she had learned to recognize the sounds. The Luftwaffe bombers, the anti-aircraft guns, the warning sirens that gave you precious minutes to reach shelter. This was different. The next morning, she mentioned it to her supervisor at the factory, Dorothy Chen, whose family had lived in London's Chinatown for 3 generations. "My cousin works at the War Office," Dorothy said quietly as they assembled fuse components. "He told me something, but made me promise not to spread panic. The Germans have a new weapon, a rocket. Travels faster than sound. You don't hear it coming." Margaret's hands stilled. "How do we protect ourselves if there's no warning?" Dorothy shook her head. "We can't. We just hope it doesn't hit us." But Margaret Hayes wasn't the type to simply hope. That evening, she walked to the impact site. The crater was enormous, 20 feet deep and 40 feet across. Rescue workers still sifted through rubble. A woman's shoe lay beside a broken photograph frame. Margaret stood at the edge, studying the destruction, trying to understand. Over the following weeks, more rockets fell. Chiswick was hit again, then Southgate, then Woolwich. The randomness terrified people more than the Blitz had. At least during the Blitz, you heard the bombers coming. You had time to react, to take cover, to pray. These rockets gave you nothing. Margaret began keeping a notebook. Each time a rocket fell within hearing distance, she noted the time, the approximate location, and anything unusual she had observed beforehand. She interviewed neighbors, asking if they had noticed anything strange before the impacts. Most people thought she was wasting her time. "What's the point, Margaret?" asked Mrs. Patterson. "They're random. There's no pattern to madness." But Margaret persisted. On October 15th, she was hanging laundry in her small backyard when she noticed something odd. Her kitchen timer, which she had been using to track how long she left the washing to soak, had developed a strange behavior. It ticked normally, then would suddenly accelerate for a few seconds, the spring mechanism seeming to vibrate more intensely before returning to its regular rhythm. She thought nothing of it at first. The timer was old, a wedding gift from Thomas's mother, its brass casing tarnished and dented. Perhaps it was finally wearing out. But 5 minutes after the timer's strange behavior, a rocket struck Ealing, 2 miles west. The house shook. The laundry basket toppled over. Margaret stood very still, staring at the timer in her hand. She rewound it slowly, her mind racing. It was probably coincidence. London was being hit multiple times a day. Any odd occurrence could seem connected to a rocket strike if you looked for patterns hard enough. 3 days later, she was preparing dinner when the timer did it again. That same rapid ticking, that same subtle vibration. She held it up to her ear, listening intently, The mechanism almost seemed to buzz. She noted the time, 7:22 in the evening. Then she waited, her heart pounding. 4.5 minutes later, the windows shook. A rocket had struck Hammersmith. Margaret sat down at her kitchen table, the timer in front of her. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear, from excitement, from possibility. She rewound the timer and listened to its steady tick. Such a simple device. A coiled spring, a gear mechanism, a brass bell. Nothing sophisticated, nothing that should be able to detect a German rocket. Unless... She thought about what Dorothy had told her. The rockets traveled faster than sound. They came from high altitude, from the edge of space itself. And they were made of metal, guided by gyroscopes and fueled by alcohol and liquid oxygen. They were essentially flying radio transmitters. Margaret had worked in the munitions factory long enough to understand basic electrical principles. They assembled proximity fuses, devices that detected metal objects through electromagnetic fields. Could her kitchen timer's spring mechanism be acting as an accidental antenna? Could it be detecting the electromagnetic signature of the rocket's guidance system? It seemed absurd, a kitchen timer detecting a weapon that traveled 3 times the speed of sound. The scientists and engineers at the War Office had all their sophisticated equipment and couldn't provide any warning. How could her cheap, dented timer succeed where they had failed? But the evidence was there in her notebook. Over the next week, she documented 6 incidents where the timer's strange behavior preceded a rocket strike by approximately 5 minutes. The correlation was undeniable. The question was, what should she do with this information? Who would believe her? A housewife claiming her kitchen timer could detect V-2 rockets would be laughed out of any official office. Worse, she might be suspected of spreading rumors or causing panic. She decided to start small. She told Mrs. Patterson, "You're exhausted, dear," Mrs. Patterson said kindly. "The stress of the war, Thomas being away, the long hours at the factory. Perhaps you should see a doctor." Margaret tried her supervisor, Dorothy, who at least listened fully before responding. "Even if it's true," Dorothy said carefully, 5 minutes isn't much warning, and you'd need to be carrying that timer everywhere. How would you alert people in time? But 5 minutes was an eternity compared to no warning at all. 5 minutes meant you could get to a shelter, you could move away from windows, you could grab your children and huddle under the stairs. 5 minutes meant the difference between life and death. On November 2nd, Margaret was walking home from her shift when the timer began its strange behavior. She was on Chiswick High Road, surrounded by evening shoppers queuing outside the butcher's shop with their ration books. The timer buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, watching the hands accelerate. Her mouth went dry. 5 minutes. Maybe less. She looked around frantically. The nearest public shelter was 2 streets away. "Everyone," she shouted, "take cover now." People stared at her. A woman with a pram laughed nervously. The butcher emerged from his shop, wiping his hands on his apron. "Please," Margaret screamed. "There's a rocket coming. Get to shelter." Something in her voice, raw and desperate, convinced them. Or perhaps they were all so worn down by war that any warning, however strange, was worth heeding. The crowd began to move, slowly at first, then faster. The woman grabbed her pram. The butcher started herding people toward the shelter. "Move! Move!" he shouted, his voice carrying authority. Margaret ran with them, counting seconds in her head. They reached the shelter, a reinforced basement beneath a church, and poured down the stairs. Someone stumbled. Others helped them up. They crowded into the damp, dark space, breathing hard, waiting. 4 minutes and 20 seconds after the timer's warning, the rocket hit. The impact was close, probably less than a quarter-mile away. The shelter shook. Dust rained from the ceiling. A young woman sobbed. An elderly man clutched his chest, but they were alive. All of them. Alive. When they emerged, they found the butcher's shop was gone. The entire building had collapsed. The facade crumbled into the street. If they had still been queuing outside, most would have died instantly. Many more would have been injured by flying glass and debris. The butcher, a big man named Frank Morrison, father of young Billy with the cricket bat, turned to Margaret. His face was white, his hands shaking. "How did you know?" he asked. Margaret showed him the timer. She explained as simply as she could. She expected disbelief, mockery. Instead, he nodded slowly. "My brother's an engineer," he said. "Works on radar systems. He's told me about electromagnetic interference. If what you're saying is true, if this timer really can detect these bloody rockets, you need to tell someone official, someone who can do something about it." But who would listen? Margaret had no connections, no credentials. She was just a factory worker with a strange story about a kitchen timer. She needed proof. She needed witnesses. She needed credibility. Over the following days, word spread through the neighborhood. The woman who had predicted the rocket. the housewife with the magical timer. People sought her out, asking if she would walk with them if she could keep them safe. Margaret found herself followed by small groups whenever she went shopping or walked to the factory. She tried to explain it wasn't magic, wasn't certain, that she could be wrong. But people didn't care about explanations. They cared about survival. And for the first time in months, they felt they had a chance. On November 15th, Margaret was approached by a man in a worn RAF uniform. He introduced himself as Squadron Leader James Fletcher. He was on medical leave, recovering from burns sustained when his Lancaster bomber was shot down over Berlin. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I've heard remarkable stories about you. I'm skeptical by nature, but I'm also desperate. My sister lives in Wandsworth with her 3 children. She's terrified every moment. If there's even a chance that what people are saying is true, I need to know." Margaret showed him her notebook, explained her observations. Fletcher studied the data carefully, his burned hands turning the pages gently. "The timing is consistent," he said finally. "And the mechanism? It's not impossible. Crude, accidental, but not impossible. I have a friend at the Air Ministry. Let me make some calls." 3 days later, Margaret found herself in a gray office in Whitehall, facing 3 men in military uniforms and 1 woman in civilian clothes. They introduced themselves: Air Commodore Harris, Colonel Stevenson, Dr. Margaret Blackwood from the Scientific Advisory Committee, and Captain Phillips from Civil Defense. Margaret placed her timer on the desk. It looked absurd there, this battered kitchen implement among official papers and classified reports. She felt ridiculous. These were serious people dealing with serious matters. What was she doing here? "Mrs. Hayes," Air Commodore Harris said, not unkindly, "please explain your theory." She did, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. She showed them her notebook, detailed her observations. Dr. Blackwood asked technical questions about the timer's construction, about the specific nature of the vibration she observed. When Margaret finished, there was a long silence. Colonel Stevenson spoke first. "It's preposterous," he said flatly. "We have millions of pounds worth of detection equipment that can't predict these rockets, and you're suggesting a kitchen timer can?" "I'm not suggesting anything, sir," Margaret replied. "I'm just telling you what I've observed." Dr. Blackwood picked up the timer, examining it closely. "May I disassemble this?" she asked. Margaret nodded. She watched as the scientist carefully opened the casing, revealing the spring mechanism inside. Dr. Blackwood pulled out a magnifying glass, studying the components. "Interesting," she murmured. "The spring is brass, quite old. There's significant corrosion here and here. That creates microscopic gaps in the metal. In theory, that could act as a very crude antenna. And the gear mechanism, when wound, creates constant motion. That could amplify any electromagnetic signal it picks up." "You're saying it's possible?" Harris asked. "I am saying it's not impossible," Dr. Blackwood corrected. "The V-2's guidance system does emit electromagnetic signals. If the conditions were exactly right, if the rocket passed close enough overhead, if this timer's particular combination of age and damage created the right antenna properties, it might possibly detect that signal." "Might? Possibly," Stevenson scoffed. "Those aren't words we can base civil defense on." "Neither is ignoring a potential early warning system," Captain Phillips said quietly. "How many people die each week because they have no warning? If Mrs. Hayes' timer provides even a few minutes, that's dozens of lives saved." They tested it, of course. For 2 weeks, Margaret was driven around London in a civil defense car, her timer always at hand. Each time it displayed its strange behavior, she reported it. Military observers tracked the subsequent rocket strikes. The correlation held. Not perfectly. Some rockets produced no warning. The timer would sometimes react when no rocket fell within detectable range, but often enough to be statistically significant. Dr. Blackwood's team tried to replicate the effect with other timers, but failed. There was something unique about Margaret's particular device, some combination of age, damage, and manufacturing quirks that created its antenna properties. They couldn't mass-produce warning devices based on her timer, but they could use Margaret herself. On December 1st, Margaret Hayes became an official civil defense observer. She was given a uniform, a salary, and a motorcycle courier, a young woman named Alice Webb, who had been a dispatch writer before the war. Their job was simple: drive through London. When the timer reacted, Alice would speed to the nearest civil defense post and sound the alarm. It was exhausting, dangerous work. They spent 12 hours a day on the road, in all weather. December was bitterly cold. Margaret's hands went numb holding the timer. Alice navigated bombed-out streets, dodging rubble and craters. Twice they were caught too close to impacts and had to shelter in damaged buildings. But they saved lives. In 3 weeks, Margaret and Alice's warnings allowed over 200 people to reach shelter before rocket strikes. The system was imperfect, the coverage limited, but it worked. Other civil defense workers began to trust them. When Margaret Hayes' motorcycle roared up to a post, sirens immediately sounded. People knew to drop everything and take cover. The housewife with the kitchen timer became a fixture of London's defense against Hitler's revenge weapons. On Christmas Eve, Margaret sat in her cold kitchen, writing a letter to Thomas. She told him about her strange new job, about the timer, about the lives saved. She told him she missed him desperately, but that she had found a purpose, a way to fight back against the randomness and terror. I always thought I was just ordinary, she wrote, just a woman keeping a house together while her husband was away. But I've learned that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. This war has taken so much from us, but it's also shown us what we're capable of. I count down minutes on a kitchen timer, and those minutes mean people get to see another day. It's not much, but it's something. It's my way of fighting back. She sealed the letter and placed it on the mantel. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the bombed-out buildings in white, making London almost beautiful again. Tomorrow she would be back on the motorcycle, Alice at the handlebars, the timer in her pocket, counting down the minutes until the next warning. The war would continue. More rockets would fall. Some she would detect, some she wouldn't. But Margaret Hayes, ordinary housewife from Chiswick, had found a way to fight back against the weapon designed to bring terror without warning. With nothing more than an old kitchen timer, her attention to patterns, and her refusal to accept helplessness, she had given her neighbors something precious: time. Time to take cover, time to grab loved ones, time to survive. In a war where every second mattered, where death arrived faster than sound, 5 minutes was everything. And as London settled into another wartime Christmas, its streets dark under blackout curtains, its people weary but unbroken, Margaret Hayes sat by her small fire and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She had made a difference. In the vast machinery of war, she was just one small part, but she was a part that mattered. The kitchen timer sat on the table beside her, its brass casing catching the firelight. Tomorrow it would warn of more rockets. Tomorrow more lives would be saved. But tonight, on Christmas Eve, it was just a timer again, counting down the peaceful minutes until morning. January brought the coldest weather London had seen in years. Ice formed on the inside of windows, water pipes froze and burst. The coal ration barely kept houses warm enough to prevent frostbite. Margaret and Alice continued their patrols, bundled in layers of wool and canvas, their faces raw from the wind. The work took its toll. Alice developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. Margaret's hands, constantly exposed to the cold as she monitored the timer, became covered in painful chilblains. But they pressed on because the alternative was unthinkable. Every day they didn't patrol was a day people had no warning. On January 9th, they were riding through Stepney when the timer began its warning dance. Alice immediately gunned the motorcycle toward the nearest civil defense post, but Margaret grabbed her shoulder. "Wait," she said, her voice tight. "This feels different." The timer wasn't just vibrating, it was shaking violently, the ticking so rapid it became almost a continuous buzz. In all her months of observation, Margaret had never seen it react this strongly. She held it closer to her ear, trying to understand what had changed. The mechanism seemed to be resonating with something. The brass casing actually warmed to the touch, despite the freezing January air. "What does it mean?" Alice shouted over the engine. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. She thought back to her conversations with Dr. Blackwood about electromagnetic fields and signal interference. A stronger reaction could mean several things. The rocket could be descending at a different angle, passing directly overhead rather than at a distance. Or the guidance system could be malfunctioning, transmitting a stronger signal. Or the thought chilled her. There could be more than one. "I don't know. Either it's malfunctioning or—" Margaret's voice trailed off. She looked up at the gray winter sky, as if she might somehow see the invisible threat approaching. The timer continued its violent shaking, and suddenly she knew with absolute certainty what it meant. "Alice, sound every alarm you can reach. I think multiple rockets are coming. This isn't one signal, it's several overlapping. Go now." Alice didn't question. She had learned to trust Margaret's instincts completely, had seen too many accurate predictions to doubt now. She drove like a woman possessed, the motorcycle engine screaming as she wove through streets still icy from the night's frost. They stopped at the first civil defense post on Commercial Road. Margaret leaped off before Alice had fully stopped running inside. "Multiple rockets incoming," she shouted to the startled warden. "Sound the alarm now." The warden, a man named George Thompson who had worked with Margaret before, grabbed the alarm handle without hesitation. The mechanical siren began its wail, that rising and falling tone that meant danger. "Take cover, move now." People on the street looked up, confused. Multiple rocket warnings were rare. Some hesitated, wondering if it was a drill or a malfunction. Margaret ran back outside, shouting at the pedestrians. "This is real! Get to shelter! Move!" A woman with 2 small children stood frozen on the pavement, clutching her shopping basket. Margaret ran to her, grabbed her arm. "Where's the nearest shelter?" The underground station, but... "Go, run, take your children and run." Something in Margaret's face, the raw terror mixed with absolute conviction, convinced the woman. She dropped her basket, grabbed her children's hands, and ran. Others followed, a growing stream of people heading toward safety. Alice had already moved to the next post, 2 streets away. Margaret could hear that siren beginning as well, then a third and a fourth. The warning spread across East London like ripples in a pond. Factory workers put down tools and headed for reinforced basements. Shop owners ushered customers toward shelters. Bus drivers stopped their vehicles and directed passengers to the nearest safe locations. Margaret stood in the middle of Commercial Road, watching people run, watching the organized chaos of a population that had learned through bitter experience to respond to warnings. She looked at the timer, still shaking in her hand. 3 minutes had passed since the initial warning. If she was right about multiple rockets, they would start falling soon. The first rocket struck 4 minutes after the initial warning, hitting a warehouse near the docks. The ground shook beneath Margaret's feet. Windows shattered in shops along Commercial Road. Then another impact, 30 seconds later, closer this time. Margaret felt the compression wave hit her chest, making it hard to breathe. Then a third explosion, and a fourth. 4 rockets within 2 minutes, all in the Stepney and Poplar areas. The coordinated barrage was devastating. Buildings collapsed, fires erupted. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous roar of destruction. But the streets were mostly empty, the shelters were full, the warning had worked. Margaret and Alice spent the next hour helping with rescue operations. They pulled an elderly man from a collapsed shopfront. They helped a family whose home had been damaged by debris, guiding them to an emergency shelter. They watched firefighters battle blazes in 3 different buildings. The destruction was immense, but the casualties were surprisingly light. Dozens injured, a handful killed, but not the hundreds that would have died without warning. As night fell, Margaret sat on the curb, exhausted beyond measure. Her hands were bleeding from digging through rubble. Her uniform was torn and filthy. Alice sat beside her, neither speaking. A civil defense supervisor named Helen Wright approached with 2 cups of hot tea. "You saved a lot of lives today, Mrs. Hayes," Helen said quietly. "The casualty count could have been catastrophic. Instead, most people made it to shelter." Margaret took the tea, wrapping her cold hands around the warm cup. "How many?" 15 confirmed dead, maybe 40 injured seriously enough to need hospital care, and 4 rocket strikes on crowded streets in the middle of the day. Helen shook her head. "Without your warning, we'd be talking about 200 dead, easily. Maybe more." The numbers should have felt like a victory, but Margaret could only think about the 15 who hadn't made it. 15 families would receive telegrams. 15 sets of loved ones would grieve. 15 people who had been alive that morning were gone. "I should have detected it sooner," Margaret said. "You gave us 5 minutes," Alice said firmly. 5 minutes is a lifetime. Don't do this to yourself." But Margaret did it anyway, running through the sequence again in her mind, wondering if there had been earlier signs she missed, if she could have given 6 minutes instead of 5. It was a habit that would stay with her long after the war ended, this constant analysis, this burden of responsibility. Alice didn't question. She had learned to trust Margaret's instincts completely. She drove like a woman possessed, stopping at 3 civil defense posts in rapid succession, each time shouting the warning before speeding to the next. Air raid sirens began to wail across East London. The first rocket struck 4 minutes after the initial warning, then another 30 seconds later, then a third. 3 impacts within 2 minutes, all in the Stepney and Poplar areas. The coordinated barrage was devastating, but thanks to the warnings, most people had reached shelter. Instead of hundreds of casualties, there were dozens. Air Commodore Harris summoned Margaret to Whitehall the next day. He looked older, more tired than when she had first met him. "Mrs. Hayes, yesterday you detected multiple rockets. How?" Margaret explained about the timer's unusually strong reaction. "I think when multiple rockets are in range simultaneously, the electromagnetic signals combine. The effect is amplified." Harris leaned back in his chair. "The Germans are changing tactics. Intelligence suggests they're preparing to launch salvos instead of single rockets. If your timer can detect that, can give us warning of coordinated attacks, you've just become even more valuable to civil defense." More valuable meant more responsibility. Margaret found herself working longer hours, covering more territory. The motorcycle patrols expanded from 12 hours to 16. She barely had time to eat or sleep. Her small house in Chiswick became just a place to collapse for a few hours before starting again. Alice began to show the strain too. The cough worsened. She grew thinner, her face gaunt and pale. One morning in late January, she collapsed beside the motorcycle. Margaret helped her to a bench, terrified. "I'm fine," Alice insisted, but her breathing was labored. "Just need a moment." Margaret made a decision. "We're getting you to a doctor. We can't. We're on patrol. The patrol can wait. You're no good to anyone if you die of pneumonia. The doctor at the emergency clinic diagnosed Alice with severe bronchitis, probably developing into pneumonia. She needed rest, warmth, and medication. She needed to stop riding a motorcycle through freezing London streets for 16 hours a day. Alice was reassigned to administrative duties. Her replacement was a young man named David Chen, Dorothy's cousin from the factory, who had been rejected for military service due to poor eyesight, but was an excellent motorcycle rider. He was eager, competent, but he wasn't Alice. Margaret missed her partner's steady presence, her ability to anticipate what was needed without words. Still, the work continued. February brought a slight warming, but also increased rocket attacks. Hitler was desperate now, throwing everything he had at London in hopes of breaking British morale before the Allied armies reached Germany. Some days, Margaret and David detected 5 or 6 rockets. The timer became her entire world, its ticking the soundtrack to her existence. One evening, exhausted after a particularly long patrol, Margaret returned home to find a letter waiting. She recognized Thomas's handwriting immediately. Her hands shook as she opened it. He was alive. He was well. His unit had participated in the liberation of several French towns and was now advancing into Belgium. He had received all her letters and was amazed by what she was doing. "I always knew you were extraordinary," he wrote, "but I never imagined you'd be fighting the war with a kitchen timer. The men in my unit talk about the rockets, about how they're the worst thing about this whole bloody war because you can't defend against them. When I tell them about you, about what you're doing, they can't believe it. You're giving people hope, Margaret. That's worth more than any weapon." Margaret read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in the box where she kept all his correspondence. She allowed herself to cry, just for a moment. Tears of relief that he was alive, tears of exhaustion, tears of loneliness. Then she dried her eyes, made herself a cup of weak tea, and prepared for the next day's patrol. March brought longer days and the promise of spring. It also brought news that the Allied armies were crossing the Rhine, pushing deep into Germany. The end of the war felt close now, tantalizingly close, but the rockets continued to fall. On March 8th, Margaret was patrolling through Westminster when she encountered something unexpected. A group of American journalists had come to London to report on the rocket attacks. One of them, a woman named Sarah Mitchell from a Chicago newspaper, had heard about Margaret and wanted to interview her. "I don't think that's a good idea," Margaret said. "I'm just doing a job." "You're doing much more than that," Sarah insisted. "The American people need to hear stories like yours, stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. It gives hope." Margaret reluctantly agreed to a brief interview, conducted while she continued her patrol. Sarah rode in a civil defense car that followed the motorcycle, taking notes as Margaret explained her work. "How do you handle the pressure?" Sarah asked, "knowing that lives depend on whether you're paying attention to that timer?" Margaret had never really thought about it that way. She had just done what needed doing, but now, forced to articulate it, she realized how heavy the burden had become. "You don't think about it," she said finally. "If you think too much about the responsibility, about what happens if you miss a warning, you'd freeze up. You just focus on the task, watch the timer, sound the alarm, do your job." The interview was published 3 weeks later in newspapers across America. Margaret Hayes, the housewife who detected rockets with a kitchen timer, became a minor celebrity. Letters arrived from strangers thanking her, encouraging her, sharing their own stories of hardship and perseverance. One letter particularly moved her. It was from a woman in Manchester whose daughter had been visiting London in December and had survived a rocket attack because of Margaret's warning. The woman had written simply, "You saved my daughter's life. I will never forget you. Thank you." Margaret kept that letter in her pocket, along with the timer. On days when she was too tired to continue, when her body ached and her spirit flagged, she would touch the letter and remember why she did this work. She had pinned others on her kitchen wall, dozens of them now, from people across Britain and even some from America. Each one represented a life touched, a moment of hope in the darkness. One letter came from a schoolteacher in Bethnal Green. Her entire class of 30 children had been in the schoolyard when Margaret's warning came through. They had practiced rocket drills, knew exactly what to do. They filed into the reinforced basement in orderly lines, and were singing songs to keep calm when the rocket struck 2 streets away. Every child survived without injury. The teacher wrote, "You gave my students their future. Some of them will become doctors, engineers, teachers. Some will write books, compose music, change the world in ways we cannot imagine, all because you paid attention to a kitchen timer." Margaret read that letter on particularly difficult days, when the weight of responsibility threatened to crush her. Children with futures ahead of them. That was worth every frozen morning, every exhausted evening, every moment of doubt. The work also brought unexpected connections. Margaret found herself part of a community of people doing extraordinary things in ordinary ways. There was Sarah Chen, who had developed a system for predicting which buildings were most likely to collapse after bomb damage, saving rescue workers' lives. There was Patrick O'Brien, a dock worker who had figured out how to identify unexploded bombs by the sound they made settling into Earth. There was Elizabeth Manning, a nurse who had pioneered new techniques for treating burn victims. They met occasionally at War Office briefings, this strange collection of civilians who had become specialists in survival. They shared information, supported each other, understood what others couldn't. The burden of being responsible for lives, the guilt when you couldn't save everyone, the exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness into something deeper, a weariness of the soul. "How do you keep going?" Patrick asked her once, over weak coffee in a ministry cafeteria. Margaret thought about it. "I think about Thomas, somewhere in France, doing his duty. I think about all the men and women in uniform who don't get to choose when to stop, when to rest. And I think that if they can keep going, so can I. This is my bit. It's not much, but it's mine." The truth was more complex. Some days she kept going through sheer stubbornness. Some days through guilt, knowing that taking a day off might mean someone died. Some days through hope that the war would end soon and she could return to a normal life. And some days she kept going simply because she didn't know how to stop, because the routine of patrol and warning had become her entire existence. April arrived with warm sunshine and blooming flowers in the parks, incongruous against the bombed buildings and crater-scarred streets. Margaret noticed the changes in small ways. Birdsong in the morning, something she had forgotten could exist alongside air raid sirens, daffodils pushing up through rubble. Children playing in the streets with a freedom they hadn't had in months, their parents less fearful now that the rocket attacks were becoming sporadic. The rocket attacks became less frequent as Allied forces overran German launch sites in the Netherlands. Days would pass between strikes now instead of hours. Margaret found herself almost disappointed when the timer remained quiet, then felt guilty for the thought. Quiet was good. Quiet meant no one was dying, but quiet also meant her purpose was ending, and she wasn't ready for that yet. On April 10th, Margaret detected what would be her last rocket. She was riding through Islington when the timer began its familiar vibration. David immediately turned toward the nearest civil defense post. The warning was sounded. People took shelter. The rocket struck a factory that had already been evacuated. No casualties. 8 days later, on April 18th, the last V-2 rocket fell on London, striking Orpington in Kent. Margaret didn't detect it. She was at home, finally taking a day off on Dr. Blackwood's orders. The scientist had noticed Margaret's deteriorating health and insisted she rest. When news came that the rocket attacks had ended, Margaret felt an unexpected emptiness. For 6 months, the timer had been her constant companion, her purpose, her way of fighting back. Now what? Who was she without this mission? On May 8th, Germany surrendered. Victory in Europe Day brought wild celebrations. London exploded in joy. Strangers kissed in the streets. Bonfires burned despite the blackout regulations that were finally lifted. Church bells rang for the first time in years. Margaret stood in Trafalgar Square with thousands of others watching searchlights paint patterns across the sky. No more hiding those lights from German bombers. No more fear. David stood beside her, and Alice, recovered now, had come to join them. They didn't say much. They just stood together, 3 people who had shared something extraordinary. Thomas came home in June, thin and scarred, but alive. Margaret barely recognized him at first. He looked older, worn down by things he wouldn't talk about. But when he saw her, his face broke into the smile she remembered. They held each other in the doorway of their Chiswick house for a long time, not speaking, just holding on. When they finally went inside, Margaret made tea with real sugar, a luxury she had saved for this moment. "Tell me everything," Thomas said. So she did. She told him about discovering the timer's properties, about the patrols with Alice and David, about the lives saved. She showed him her notebooks, filled with dates and times and observations. He listened, asking questions, shaking his head in amazement. "My brilliant wife," he said finally. "I left you to manage on your own, and you ended up saving hundreds of lives with a wedding present for my mother. She'd be proud. I'm proud." The government wanted to keep the timer for study, but Dr. Blackwood advocated for returning it to Margaret. It was, after all, her property. In July, at a small ceremony at the War Office, Air Commodore Harris presented Margaret with a commendation for her service to civil defense. The timer was returned to her, polished and placed in a velvet-lined box. "Mrs. Hayes," Harris said, "you prove that heroism doesn't require uniforms or weapons. Sometimes it just requires paying attention, refusing to give up, and a bit of a stubborn streak. On behalf of a grateful nation, thank you." Margaret accepted the commendation and the timer. That evening, she and Thomas sat in their small garden watching the sun set over London. The city was scarred, damaged, but alive. Slowly, it would rebuild. Houses would be repaired, streets cleared, lives reconstructed. "What will you do with it?" Thomas asked, nodding toward the timer. Margaret turned it over in her hands, feeling its familiar weight. "I think I'll use it for what it was meant for. cooking Sunday roasts, timing tea, ordinary things. After everything, you want ordinary? She smiled. I've learned that ordinary is extraordinary. Ordinary people, living ordinary lives, but rising to meet whatever comes. That's what won this war, Thomas. Not just the soldiers and pilots and sailors. It was people like Mrs. Patterson and Frank Morrison and Alice Webb. People who just refused to give up. The timer sat on their kitchen shelf after that, back to its mundane duties. Occasionally, visitors would ask to see it, to hear the story of the housewife who detected rockets. Margaret would tell them, though the story grew shorter with each retelling. It wasn't that she had forgotten, it was that she had moved on. She returned to a normal life, though nothing felt quite normal anymore. She and Thomas talked about starting a family, about rebuilding their lives in a world without war. Some nights, she would wake from dreams where she was still on the motorcycle, watching the timer, counting down minutes. But those dreams faded over time. Years later, historians would study the V-2 attacks on London, analyzing casualty rates, impact patterns, defense measures. In the footnotes of some of those studies, there would be brief mentions of an unusual early warning system involving a housewife and a kitchen timer. Most people reading those footnotes would assume it was an exaggeration, perhaps even a myth. A kitchen timer detecting supersonic rockets? Impossible. But for the 247 people whose lives were saved by Margaret Hayes' warnings, it wasn't a myth. It was simply the truth. In the darkest days of the war, when death arrived without warning and hope seemed foolish, an ordinary woman with an ordinary kitchen timer had made the impossible possible. The timer itself never worked quite the same way again. Whatever unique combination of age, damage, and circumstance had given it, its unusual properties had been disturbed by the cleaning and polishing. It was just a timer now, but it had been enough. For 6 months in 1944 and 1945, it had been exactly what London needed. Margaret Hayes lived a long life after the war. She had 3 children, worked as a teacher, volunteered with civil defense organizations, and watched her grandchildren grow up in a world without bombs and rockets. The timer stayed with her through all of it, a constant reminder that sometimes the most ordinary things can serve the most extraordinary purposes. When she passed away in 1982, the timer was donated to the Imperial War Museum, where it sits today in a small display case. The placard reads, Kitchen Timer, circa 1935. Used by Margaret Hayes to detect V-2 rockets, 1944-1945. Estimated lives saved, 247. Visitors often walk past it without a second glance. It's just an old brass timer, dented and tarnished, unremarkable among the museum's collection of weapons, uniforms, and military hardware. But those who stop to read the placard, who take the time to understand its story, leave with a different perspective. Heroism doesn't always come in dramatic forms. Sometimes it's just paying attention. Sometimes it's refusing to accept that nothing can be done. Sometimes it's a woman in an apron, counting down minutes on a kitchen timer, giving people the one thing they needed most, time to survive.